lecture series. We have Karen Sparck-Jones today from England, and she's talking to us on automatic information and language processing.
Rethinking evaluation. He missed the most important part of the title. There we go. Okay, this is meant to be a discussion talk rather than a reporting what I have done a talk. So I hope you will approach it in that light. Okay. People have been doing a lot of evaluation. This is the sort of summary of the talk. People have been doing a lot of evaluation, especially in the last few years. And there is no doubt that what they have done has been good for the development of information and language processing technology. But this evaluation is really, in my view, far more limited than it appears to be. And it's limited not, in fact, because the systems that we can so far build are in general rather poor, but because of the nature of the task context, or contexts, in which those systems are supposed to be embedded. And what I think we should learn, if we look at these limitations, is that we need to reconsider the model of evaluation and of automatic processing systems and their use that underlies this evaluation style. The underlying model essentially is that we have a system that plugs into a context. And my argument, which I'm going to bring evidence for you today, is that this is really a defective model. This sort of plug-in model is actually wrong. And I think it's particularly wrong because of the way that information technology generically is actually developing, as it's evolving right under our noses. And the take-home message I want to give you today is that don't look at the system, look at its role in its context. And I think that some of what I'm going to say is going to appear heretical, but nevertheless, I think it's a heresy whose time has come. So the structure of the talk is that I'm going to review the state of system development, or systems for tasks, namely for information retrieval, speech recognition, machine translation, information extraction, I should say, automatic summarizing, and what I've called intelligent inquiry. Now, I'm not going to review in the sense I'm going to talk in detail about what work has been done and who by. What I want to do is to look at these different tasks in which there has been evaluation effort with respect to the evaluation paradigm that has been dominant in them, which is, of course, the DARPA paradigm, what the properties of these tasks are, what assumptions are made by this paradigm, and what justification it therefore has, and hence, in consequence, I'll say, because of the justification that's given and the weakness of that justification, what deficiencies there are in the evaluation. Then, after pulling together what I've said about the individual tasks, I want to consider the impact of the current evolution of IT and suggest that, therefore, what we need is some new directions in evaluation. I just want to mention a few terms that I shall use, not in a particularly aggressive way, but just to make sure that you understand what I'm using. We can think of evaluation as dealing possibly with components, more typically in our present context with whole systems. And systems, of course, in something which I've called in a book I wrote about evaluation a few years back, a setup, which includes data and people. That's to say what the context is in which the system is actually functioning. The system itself does a task which is defined intrinsically by objectives, and it has a function in the context which is supplied by the nature of the setup in which the system is embedded. We evaluate using criteria. Those are rather broad notions, and what we've got to do then is to refine them down through some interpretation as specific performance measures for our system, and we in turn have to provide details of the methods by which those measures are applied. And we do that, this evaluation, with respect to system parameters, I should have said, and environment variables. The system is operating in an environment we specify it by variables and their values, and the system, it says, has parameters, and again, we give them different settings. And what we're doing is evaluating with respect to intrinsic effectiveness relative to the system objectives, or with extrinsic usage considerations relative to the system's function. I'm going to start with the case where the approach to evaluation is really well established, and also where, to many people in particular, the task seems rather simple, namely information retrieval, that's to say document or text retrieval. Evaluation here as represented by the very large NIST DARPA TREC program, which has been running for the best part of a decade. Okay, this all seems really rather clear and well understood. What we do is we evaluate on relevant document delivery with respect to some set of requests, topic requests, of course the set of documents that we have in a file we're searching, and the evaluation also requires some assessment of the relevance of documents to those, the needs that lie behind those requests which users put. We measure effectiveness by precision and recall. Performance in these evaluations is primarily of the system as a black box, although it is fair to recognize that in much of the detailed work done by individual participants, there is a lot of glass box evaluation as well. Now, it's clear that a retrieval system must, if it's going to be any good, retrieve relevant documents. That seems so patently obvious that there could be no controversy about it. And of course, in building automated systems, what we're trying to do is also to make the business of retrieving relevant documents not very taxing on the user. But in the way that we do these experiments, there's a great deal of simplification, of abstraction, through ignoring real messy detail that actually occurs in retrieval situations in the world. Some things have to be dealt with. You can't run experiments at all unless you do things like deciding how you're going to handle different degrees of relevance. How you're going to deal with incomparable output, like if you have Boolean searches which retrieve different sizes of document set. You have to handle that in relation to the judgment of what recall and precision figures actually tell you. You have to give precise forms of the measures, the way that you're going to do recall and precision. Are you going to apply them to document cutoff or to recall cutoff, for example? You have to decide on those sort of things because you can't do an evaluation of any sort without them. But nevertheless, even so, there are a lot of things which are important in the real retrieval situation which are simply ignored in all of these kind of experiments. For example, the degree of overlap between the documents. Nobody in these evaluations has addressed anything to do with whether one document says essentially the same as another, and the user might therefore not be interested in both of them. There's no real assessment of efficiency, effectiveness trade-offs. There's no consideration of other aspects of users' needs, like whether they want a specialist paper or they want an introductory paper. These are just examples of real features of real situations that are simply ignored in this kind of evaluation. Essentially what's being done is simplification, reduction to, quotes, essentials, in order to be able to do controlled laboratory tests. That's the actual paradigm. And the question one has to ask then is, although users have to figure, in order to do any evaluation at all, because they have to provide requests and make relevance assessments for you to determine performance, you really have to ask whether, in the way that these IR tests are done, the user is really there in any substantial sense. And you can encapsulate this question by saying, if you do evaluation looking at average precision performance over 1,000 ranks of retrieved documents, what's that got to do with how any real user thinks about retrieval? How does an approach that focuses on a number like that have anything to do with the real situation? And just to emphasize, for those of you who are not familiar with retrieval, a little bit about what this kind of reality is like, let's imagine we have a user who's interested in documents on modern laser printing technology. And let's consider a case where the system, case one, where the system retrieves at rank 5 a document about laser technology development and applications, which has got a paragraph in it about printing. And at rank 10, a document about modern printing technology, including a paragraph about lasers. And let's imagine that these paragraphs are the relevant parts of these documents, and they are essentially very similar in what they say. What, in that case, is the user thinking by the time he reaches rank 10? He's already had some surrounding document in which paragraph on printing has been embedded, coming from the laser technology angle. He's thinking one thing by the time he gets to rank 10, which is a different document, but it contains the same paragraph. Supposing we now had a second case where the system simply reversed those two ranks. We changed our matching algorithm and we reversed the two ranks. In that case, what would the user think by rank 10 because of what he's learnt? After rank 10, system performance is the same, but nevertheless, from the user's point of view, it's not clear that it is going to be the same because he's got a paragraph, but he's got it in a certain viewpoint, which may change the way he thinks about everything. So that's an example, a very small example, of the sort of complexity that arises in real retrieval. This laboratory style in TREC, it pervades the whole of the text retrieval conference, not only in the main ad hoc retrieval task, but also in other variations of the task, and even in the interactive track, where people are studying actual interactive as opposed to one-off searching, which is the dominant model in the other tracks. A lot of things are excluded in the evaluation of interactive searching that are of importance to users actually doing searching, like everything to do with the screen setup. How things are presented to the user on the screen is simply wiped from all of that evaluation. I'm not saying in this that control tests aren't valuable. They're clearly very valuable. We've all been doing them for decades, and we wouldn't be doing them, I think, unless they really had some real, genuine value. Equally, of course, we're interested in system capabilities. They are important. You couldn't, I mean, unless you had a system for searching, you wouldn't be able to do retrieval at all nowadays. But nevertheless, the user is seen in this paradigm, is seen only as a sort of minimal evaluation data supplier. We have to have some requests and we have to have some assessments. He's not seen, or she is not seen as an engaged operator with and on information. Yet that's in fact what the user is, and that's what the retrieval is all about. What retrieval is supporting is the user as I'll call an information operator. The current style, I think it's not the case that the current style, like the neglect of interaction, can be justified because interactive evaluation is tough, although it is very tough. Nor, I think, because we essentially want to make life easy for the user and minimize the work they have to do. Basically, the belief is that the focus on the retrieval of relevant documents in its own right is sound, and this is justified by a notion of what I call the core task. The core task in retrieval, seems kind of tautologous, is to retrieve relevant documents. And therefore, we naturally want to we want to focus on the contribution that this core system makes to the whole thing, and we're interested in the competence that the core system has in achieving this objective of delivering well-matching documents that match well, which will turn out to be relevant to the actual user. So that's what the system objective, get good documents that match the topic well, according to how the system works, and they will actually turn out to be relevant. But I think this focus on the core, this sort of assumption that there is a core, which is a well-defined core, this is what I'm going to be attacking in this talk. And I think you can say it leads to bad things even in the retrieval case. Vicious circles, like you get so obsessed with average precision and performance percentage improvements in it that you completely lose track of the fact that out there are real users with real needs. And therefore, I think with respect to this notion of a core, what we should be asking is, can we get such a thing as a solid core technology? Is there a well-defined notion for these different tasks of core, and therefore of technology activity? How solid is our ability to do this core operation activity by now? That's another question, because that might actually affect our view on the thing. But most important, I think, is how significant in the overall task is the core in relation to the whole thing. So if you say the core of the retrieval task as a whole is retrieving relevant documents, you can still ask in a sort of crude spatial analogy, is this a big part of the total space, or is it in fact only a small part of the total space? And that's what I want to be asking about. I've asked it now. We can ask it about retrieval, and we're going to ask it about the other tasks. So in retrieval, we can say that so far, we've had very extensive, in relation to those questions, we've had very extensive evaluation, which has converged. What's been nice is it's been some sort of convergence. We've got solid core technology of essentially a statistical kind. But on the other hand, we've got really a performance plateau, about 30, 50 area, depending a bit on the quality of requests, recall and precision. And that applies whether we're doing fully automatic searching or, like in the Trek case, we do manual searching. And it's rather interesting that Gordon and Pathak recently published a paper where they searched with web engines, and they had very experienced searchers, and they told them to work like hell to get the best possible request they could, and then they took those and saw what performance they actually delivered. And it wasn't very good. In fact, it was just like the sort of Trek level with these modern web engines. And, really no hands barred approach to the search development. Now, if we're in that situation where we've got some convergent technology, but we've got a performance plateau, then it really suggests we should be attending to what the context is now. We've now reached the stage with IR where we should be looking at the context and stop messing around with fiddling with our so-called core engines. We should be asking about what the context properties are, what the core context relationship is, and essentially be shifting the focus to usage and the operations of the human users that are an intrinsic part of this wider context. The context in particular is more than just the environment, which is a rather pinned down and specified notion for your control laboratory tests. It's a rather bigger sense. And what we want to do therefore is to be asking what are users doing in their information operations. Second area now, looking at it in the light of what I've just said about information retrieval, is speech recognition. I think that may apply to more of you here, and some of what I say may appear to be rather provocative. Okay, again, we have a situation where I'm talking about continuous speech recognition. There has been a very substantial evaluation effort under DARPA's auspices, very widely believed to be an extremely successful activity. Now, in this, what I call the core competence assumption is very strong indeed. It's extremely strong. Essentially what's being done is we're defining recognition as transcription. That's what speech recognition is, transcription. And correct transcription is therefore the requirement on the core. The core engine in speech recognition is its objective is to deliver correct transcriptions. And of course, if that's what the system is all about, then things like word error rate, insert, delete, substitute, is really fine as a performance measure. And of course, equally, black box evaluation is very natural in this situation. It's a very narrow focus task. Also, again, very appropriate to have controlled laboratory testing, where we stress systems by varying the data, making the data more difficult, so that there's continually more challenge. There's more challenge now in current evaluations than there was when the SR1s began. And we can see that there has been technology convergence and advance through competitive refinement by tackling these variations on the data. So the technology of convergence, of course, has been on hidden Markov models. So there's a big advantage here, apparently, in the DARPA style. But really, when you look a little bit more closely, and you compare as speech recognition to, say, retrieval, which I've just been talking about, you could say that speech recognition is at the margin as an information and language processing task in its own right. Transcription is really a subtask. There are very few tasks, there are some tasks where transcription is the whole task. Transcription as dictation or for the dictation task, is speech recognition as a task in its own right. But mostly, of course, the speech recognition is a subtask to language processing. And if you look at it in this way, you have to say, what are the implications for speech recognition as a core to a spoken language processing system? Clearly, of course, you can't do speech-based information and language processing without some transcription. You have to do that. Seems obvious. But nevertheless, when you say that, what does it actually imply? What it implies, at least what we've got to recognize, is that speech recognition may be a necessary but not a sufficient condition for the actual task, the larger task, which is being undertaken. And there is also the situation that in practice, the speech recognition as currently done without any language understanding is not going to deliver 0 word error rate. But in particular, if we look at speech recognition being necessary but not sufficient for the task, this is because language is being used for something, and in particular language is being used for something by people. Either as, users are necessarily involved with language, so that there is a role for the user there, and speech recognition, as currently envisioned as a core task, does not recognize that role for the user at all. That's to say, even if you try to model language understanding to improve your recognition as transcription, this is not the function of the user I'm talking about. I'm talking about the user as responding to the speech, as doing something with the speech. Of course, they'll have to understand it to do something with it, but that's a different and the proper function of language understanding. Currently, what we've really got, the real issue is, where is the user? What is going on in the language understanding? Why do we need what tasks do we need language understanding for? Basically, in all of this speech recognition work, we have again hidden assumptions. And they're really assumptions about the task contexts in which speech recognition will play a role. In fact, the assumptions, they're not assumptions about architectures where you have a recognizer box and then you do some other things. There are much stronger assumptions in the way that speech recognition is currently approached about the context. And one of them is that the better the subtask performance as speech recognition, the better the encompassing task performance. That is actually an assumption. You may say it's a perfectly reasonable assumption to make, but nevertheless, it is actually an assumption. Another very important assumption, which is not sort of got out and examined enough, is that you want transcriptions as long-term records. There's a tacit assumption frequently that that is the case. But it's not an assumption that people say, is it a reasonable assumption to make? What does it actually imply? So, let's now, having said that there are some assumptions, let's actually look a little bit at the implications when we actually think about some of the tasks in which speech figures. What do these tasks in which speech, the recognition of speech has a necessary role, but what do they actually imply in relation to this notion of the core speech recognition task as transcription as near perfect as you can get it? Of course, what you really ought to be doing is evaluation on these embedding tasks. That's where your evaluation should actually be directed, because you're interested in the recognition in order to serve these tasks. So if we look at a couple of example tasks, what do we find? Let's look at spoken document retrieval. In this case, we may, although not necessarily always, we may need long-term records. So there is some interest in some reasonable quality of transcription because these things are going to have a long life. There is a default presumption that the longer you want to keep them, the better they've got to be. I'm not sure whether that's reasonable, but let's say there certainly seems to be, in many situations, a need for long-term records. But in fact, if the only task you're thinking about, even in fact in the long-term case, is retrieval, how good do the transcriptions have to be? Well, we know already that the transcriptions don't have to be very good in order to be able to retrieve relevant documents. The retrieval strategy is far more dominant than the recognition quality on the actual retrieval operation itself. Nevertheless, within the embedding task, it may be the case that you do need some quality, good quality of transcription, because when the user is looking at the retrieved document, when the user is inspecting the retrieved documents, listening to them is awfully slow, and skimming, reading them is much quicker. If the transcription is of too low quality, then this will be a very painful and onerous task. But the point about that is you have to look at what the total encompassing task is in order to judge what sort of quality of transcription you actually are needing. So as I say, you need to think about what your measures are like, because it may be the thing called term error rate is more appropriate for the retrieval task than word error rate in relation to recognition quality, because, for example, function words don't count in retrieval, word order doesn't count in retrieval. Then there's this other question of how you're going to use the documents when you deliver them to the user. How's he going to use them, she going to use them? And then, of course, as I've also already suggested in relation to the retrieval task itself, the business of retrieving documents may be only a small part of the whole global information retrieval context in which the user is operating. Like, what's he doing with the documents, not merely when he's inspected them, but subsequently, how's he using them? How's he thinking about revising his search? All of these kind of things. Second example is spoken information inquiry, where we should perhaps be looking at the context. We should be looking at the context a little more carefully. In this case, it's not clear, and in many situations, we simply don't need any long-term records. So we only want quality of recognition adequate for now, without any question that people will want to inspect the transcriptions later. Now, it's clear that in spoken information inquiry, you do need some reasonable quality of recognition to deliver you anchors for the language understanding that the information inquiry has to actually carry out. But it doesn't follow that it needs to be perfect, because particularly in limited applications, the context knowledge, domain knowledge may supply what's missing for the interpretation. Or indeed, if you're running an inquiry system which is in dialogue, you can have clarification. And then indeed, it's also the case that if you're thinking about dialogue, your evaluation, as in the retrieval case, has got to be addressed to the ability of the dialogue to satisfy the user's information need. Evaluation has got to be addressed to the whole of that, not to the individual little bits that are associated only with the recognition. And in fact, dialogue typically in real life allows very tolerant interaction in relation to, for example, things that somebody hasn't understood, or in this case, that the transcription engine hasn't done very well. For example, here's just a simple example. Supposing the user says, do you have trains after 6? And the system says yes at 7:30 and 8:30. And the user says, including Sunday. Now, let's imagine that's all perfect. The system has understood the user's inquiry perfectly, and therefore it's all going. Now, it may be the case we want to have our recognizer good enough that it wouldn't interpret do you have trains after 6 as do you have drains after 6. You'd like to get rid of things like that. That's, really rather a nuisance. But again, you might be able to do that from your domain model. Not necessarily. You might say, well, drains must mean trains. Consider the case where the speech recognizer didn't work very well, and in the first thing it says, do you have trains after 6? The user says, and the system can only get, do you have trains, and can't assign any interpretation to the end of the input utterance. Well, then the system can perfectly well say, sorry, what precisely is it you want to know? Or about the trains or something. Now, the user might then say, trains after 6 on Sunday. Now, notice that in that case, in that reply to the clarification question, the user has supplied an additional piece of information which in the previous dialogue was provided as a separate input. So it's not clear in those two cases, although the speech recognition in the second case is, quotes, less good, the overall efficiency of the dialogue is less good. So, summarizing then about speech recognition so far, in relation to the kind of concerns that I've been raising, as those two cases have just illustrated, the user there are many of the tasks, not necessarily all, but many of the tasks in which speech has a role. The user also has a key role. And even if you think for those tasks, like spoken document retrieval or the dialogue case, the user has a role, if you think of them as constituting a core, and forgetting very much about the yet larger context. In the way that, of course, the user doesn't have a role in the speech recognition subtask specifically. And then also, as I say, the users have got a role in these larger situations. So you need to check these contexts in relation to the functionality that you're expecting from the speech recognizer. The speech recognition so far, I think we have got some core technology, but it is very, very condition dependent. Performance with noisy continuous speech is rather poor. Therefore, what you can say is we've got some technology which is good for some tasks, presumably not for other tasks. But we can only make judgments like that unless we pursue this will-o'-the-wisp of 100% correct transcription by attending to the context, and especially where do the users go in this context with what they supply of knowledge of the world and language. So what I'm suggesting is we really need to back off from the absolutist call there, that speech recognition, the better it is, the better everything will be. Next task, machine translation. This has got a very long, it's like retrieval, it's got a very long evaluation tradition, mainly not in fact a DARPA tradition, although DARPA has done some translation evaluation. In some ways, in these evaluations, as many of them, non-DARPA ones have also been done, there seems to be some sort of analogy to the speech recognition case, i.e. there's some sort of core there, but it's now at the task level rather than at the subtask level. It looks similar to the speech recognition case, except that, of course, translation is a really very complicated activity, operation. There's a lot more complexity in the detail. So you get these ideas that you will evaluate by what I've called informally here input accuracy or fidelity. Like, for example, the ability of your system to identify the correct sense of an input word. And equally, evaluate by what I've labeled informally output propriety or comprehensibility. That means, like, propriety means that you get the syntactic instructions in the output language right. I'm not assigning responsibility for this to the analyzer or the generator in the system. I'm simply saying that there are two aspects to what you want to do. You want to get what the input was like and make sure you get it in the output. The output is linguistically adequate in its own right. These notions, these accuracy and propriety notions, people try to operationalize them by some sort of semi-objective counting or grading measures. You know, you count the number of errors there are, or you grade the output in terms of very proper, moderately proper, and pretty improper, or something like that. Now, as I said, there is an assumption in this sort of thing that the notion of errors in translation, that you can have a usage-free core like the speech recognition case, even though in practice, in evaluation, it is not automatic because you tend to have human judges who say whether things are faithful or not to the input. But that's just a mechanism for the evaluation. That's not using the users, in quotes, in a real sense. But the trouble is that seems fine, but it's actually not at all fine, really, because it's hard to operationalize these notions of fidelity and propriety because you can't translate word for word. Word for word translation is not a flyer. It's not translation. It's word for word something. And as soon as you are forced, as you are in machine translation, to abandon word-for-word translation as a viable strategy, you have the challenge of how you do objective evaluation. Counting errors or howlers or some other kind of goofs is just inadequate as a strategy for evaluation. But the problem is that translation is a very complex process, and in some sense it's very open. There are many different ways in which you can translate even an apparently quite simple sentence. Translation is not a univocal deterministic process. And as a consequence of that, the idea of literal, that's to say the idea of literal or fair translation is not a well-defined notion. And of course, if you haven't got some notion like literal translation, you haven't got some objective basis for evaluation. And essentially what you haven't got is this notion of the core of a translation system, which you can define what its objectives are and you can evaluate in an objective manner in relation to those objectives. Like in this case, produce a correct and properly expressed translation. Really what you're talking about is, let's call it reasonable or acceptable translations by judges. But then when you do that, you're really actually asking for what purpose? What is a reasonable or an acceptable translation? These judges are standing in for something. They're standing in for some reference to some situation of use for the translations. And if you say that, if you say that explicitly, then you should say, all right, let's encourage evaluation by acceptability, but let's make it clear, acceptability for what? What is the translation actually for? And of course, that implies that you can't talk about a single all-purpose core translation system. What you've got to talk about is a variable core, which is cores that are appropriate for different kinds of circumstances. And indeed, criteria like comprehensibility, they are indeed, or acceptability, they are actually also tacitly making assumptions about the context of use. And just to illustrate that for you with a translation example, very simple one. Now, this is a bit peculiar because I wasn't at all sure how many languages you guys would know, so I'm translating from English into English, which is a bit peculiar, but I think I can explain the point to you. We have the input sentence, she borrowed the book and failed to return it. Now, and is an interesting word, as we know in English. It is ambiguous. Let's imagine that in the output language, we are obliged to translate it either into and or into but. There are two different words, two different equivalents for this ambiguous English word, and. So the question is, do we translate into this English output language as she borrowed the book and failed to return it, or she borrowed the book but failed to return it? Is one better than the other? Is one correct? What happens if the translation system, possibly as a result of some syntactic constraints in the output language, translates it as she borrowed and failed to return the book, or she borrowed but failed to return the book? Now, who's to say that any one of those is right and the other one is wrong? The assumption is that if you could only figure out sufficiently precisely that and in the original input sentence meant but, then the second one of these, she borrowed the book, but failed to return it, is correct. But language isn't as cut and dried as that. There's a resonance in the English which comes from the ambiguity, which makes this open choice in the output. Now, in fact, the relation, so basically, it's when you talk about translation, you can't talk about correct translation, so this is really subverting the whole idea of a core translation engine. And in fact, the relationship between quality and role of the translation in relation to some encompassing task is recognized in things like Japanese project, a Japanese company was translating the titles of scientific articles. Now, Japanese has a lot of problems with articles, with definite, indefinite articles. And their translations weren't very good, but they were really fine for the purposes for which they wanted, which was that people could skim the titles to find out whether the documents were in an area which was likely to be of interest in. Notice that's not as tight as relevance, that's just skimming the thing to decide whether it might even be faintly worth looking at the actual article. And indeed, this idea of correlating translation quality to embedding functionality was elaborated at the Granada conference last year, where people talked about the task hierarchy, some of them more demanding on translation than others, and corresponding appropriate different evaluation conditions. For example, the requirement on translation is much less stringent if you just want to do something like translation in support of some kind of retrieval operation than, for example, if you're doing translation in the support of multinational contract making where things have got to be very correct in order because they're going to be legally binding. So the situation with machine translation so far is that we have got successful applications, typically very specialized and requiring a lot of apparatus pertinent to that particular application. There's rather little generic technology in the sense you can just pick up an empty system and plug it into some new domain or application and it'll all roll. In theory, there is this attractive idea that you could approximate to a sort of all-purpose core, but as I suggested, it is a very approximate idea. It doesn't stand up very well when you actually try to take it apart and say, okay, well, how would we evaluate this core? What exactly should it be able to do? In reality, really, I'm saying you need to attend to the context. Certainly, we can do it already for some tasks, and while there's a lot more work needed on translation, because we do need to work on the core capabilities, we should think about developing the technology in the context of these tasks. And in particular, again, in relation to what assumptions are we making about the human user, what they're going to be using the stuff for, how much they bring to compensate for its inadequacies, or alternatively, what happens if they're misled by its inadequacies. That's equally important. You have to look at the role of the user. So, and in particular, I think if you say, if we translate as well as possible, that will serve all purposes, that is not necessarily the case, because you're still assuming that the readers of the output are going to have the same sort of, say, technical knowledge as the readers of the input. So there's a tacit contextual assumption even so. But basically, really, because translation is a very complex task in choice of syntactic and semantic aspects of the language, it has complex implications for and interactions with the use to which it's put. It may, for example, in some situations, be more important to get the vocabulary right than the syntax. That's a rather tendentious remark, but you can imagine that as an example. Okay, now, information extraction. This is another place where DARPA has done heavy-duty work in supporting evaluation. We've had a very long series of tests, evaluations, following the speech recognition paradigm. What we have is specific, fully detailed answers, like the reference transcription of a speech case, but of course more complex, because they have to allow for the fact that when you're extracting information, you can be partially successful about it. The notion of partial success in transcription of an individual word doesn't really count, but in the information extraction case, there is a notion of partial success. The measures used are recall and precision, and they're applied rather like word error rate in the speech case, although that's to say you have numerical measures, although the interpretation is rather different from the way that these measures, these recall and precision measures, are interpreted in the retrieval case. The notion of correctness here for this core task of information, this supposedly core task of information extraction, is very strong, because there's very, as I say, it's a consequence really because of the details. Somebody's saying, this exactly is what you should be getting. And that applied both in the earlier tests where people were filling slots in whole complex templates, and in the later tests where the system requirements were weakened somewhat to do things like just identifying named entities. Again, it was very, very precise what you had to get. Now, my view is that this is completely wrong. Information extraction is not at all like speech recognition. It's so completely different that treating it in evaluation as if it was speech recognition is radically misconceived. The DARPA evaluations are very, very artificial, and when you actually look at them closely, are really very strange. It's an example of the way that people can get hooked into a way of doing things without standing back and examining what's actually going on. In the conventional DARPA-style information extraction evaluation, there's actually no information at all supplied as part of the evaluation apparatus about the task context. I mean, we all know there are analysts over there in places we don't mention, but that's not what I mean an adequate level of information. There's no statement of the use to which the extracted information is going to be put. No functional role for this stuff. Some other work on information extraction one has been able to see, even if not formally carried through, a functional role. But in these DARPA stuff, there isn't a functional role specified. As a consequence, there's no rationale supplied for the style of the answers which you're actually given as your answered data to do your evaluations. We have generic information categories, you know, terrorist incidents, company mergers. We have notions of frames supplied. We have sets of fills supplied in the detailed evaluations, like the alternative equivalents for, let's say, some lexical item in a translation test. But basically, none of that is given any rationale as to why things should be done in this way. There's no definition or no characterization of the usage constraints for this material, which justify these particular specifications of what the systems are supposed to be doing. Now you could say, if that's what the system's supposed to be doing, then you measure the success of the systems in doing them. But that's not really right, because it might turn out that if you apparently didn't succeed in doing it very well, what you're supposed to be doing, it nevertheless might be better or as good as for the actual embedding contextual task. You have no chance of actually investigating this. And in fact, the lack of context is much less justifiable than in the speech recognition case, because there is a kind of notion of default in the speech recognition case. Well, get the word right. And even in the NT case, although there are all these difficulties about literal translation, there still is, you can do something with it in the sense you can see, well, you know, there is a default. The word ought to be this, whatever it might be, some particular lexical item. There aren't, in the information extraction case, there are no natural defaults. Even for a category, supposing you say, let's extract information about terrorist incidents, for example. Well, is it or is it not part of one's notion, your independent notion of a terrorist incident, that you should include not only who the terrorists were and where the incident occurred, that seems pretty obvious, but the reason for the incident. Is that or is that not a default factual piece of information when you're thinking in your heads about terrorist incidents? Really, there is no way, if you're given a text, its meaning is to say, extract the essential information. Supposing you say, let's forget about the specification. Don't say we want a system to extract the essential information. What is the essential information in the text? If you say extract all the information, what is all the information in the text? There are no defaults. There's nothing you can say that we would certainly want an information extraction system to do, regardless of the fact that DARPA hasn't told us why they want it. Essentially, we're assuming that the output will satisfy some intended use, but we have no independent way of verifying whether the output we actually produce will meet that, that intended use. And we don't even get indicators in the shape of with retrieval we do, where we at least have some user requests. And yet, if you think about it, when you say what is the output of an information extraction system for, the functional requirements are very different. If you're saying it's going to be used for alerting people, or it's going to be put into a formal database in which people are going to operate with, you know, whatever these standard database engines are, because formal database engines assume things like semantics of the database and entity integrity and all those kind of things. And we have no idea whether those assumptions are going to be imposed on the output of the information extraction program. If they were, for example, we might be more cautious about how we filled slots. And just to illustrate that point, supposing we have this little tiny text. The company announced some developments. Boxco, the packaging subsidiary, would merge with Bags Inc. The subsidiary would enter Bags Inc.'s Japanese market. Now, supposing we're filling a database tuple, that's what we're doing. Should you fill in the thing which says Boxco to market in Japan, or should we fill in some kind of compound entity, Boxco and Bags Inc. to market in Japan? When one says a subsidiary is going to merge with some other company, what is the result of that merge? Is it the original taking over company or some amalgam of the two merged companies? And yet that difference could be something that's very critical to how you do a database entry. So it's not, you know, it's actually, you have to think about what assumption, whereas if you're doing alerting, it probably wouldn't matter very much. Boxco would do just as well. Information extraction so far has had, it's had a few very specialized applications, looking at its state, current state. We have some tools, or rather I think more methodologies, things like shallow parsing. But progress with core systems has been, I think, rather poor. Overall performance in all these muck evaluations is only so-so, like 50% or whatever it is. But if you say, why is the performance poor? Gosh, we've got to work a lot more on the core technology. I think the issue here is not that, in fact, the systems are not working well, and therefore, I mean, the issue about the poor performance is not that the core systems are not working very well. It's basically that the notion of core itself is weak. You can't make systems work well in a core operation if they don't know what the core actually is. In fact, it's noticeable that performance has been best on the least demanding and also least controversial subtask, namely named entity identification. There's much more limitation in the evaluations, or even disagreement about whether you can have evaluation at all, with some of the subtler subtasks in this information thing, things like co-referentiality or predicate argument structures. And I think it's indicative that there is disagreement about that, because that's actually suggesting this notion of information extraction itself is not well defined. If you can't agree about predicate arguments, that's partly because you don't know what information is in relation to You can't define predicate arguments in relation to information because you don't really know what the information is. So when we're saying what is, what is the information to actually extract? Information extraction, in other words, is intrinsically context dependent, and therefore you can't really think of having any kind of autonomous core evaluation, even to the limited extent that you might sort of approximate to it in machine translation. You've got to attend to the context and primarily to the human user. I want to turn now much more briefly to the two other tasks I mentioned. Basically because much less evaluation has been done on them. Also, very little in the DARPA style. The evaluation that's been done has been rather scattered. First of all, automatic summarizing. Does this have a core task? Notice that I'm not talking about extracting texts, bits of text from longer text. I'm talking actually summarizing. Is this a core task in the sense in which we might have translation as a core task, or might seek to have translation as a core task? I mean, do we have something which is straightforward reduction of a long text, or discourse, of course, could be spoken, to its essentials? Can we evaluate in a manner which is analogous to translation, by fidelity and propriety? Of course, the task is intrinsically much more complex than the translation one. The translation one has got two languages. At least you're not varying the information level between the input and the output. Essentially, a particular feature of that is that condensation isn't locally bounded. You're condensing a whole long text, and you can't confine the scope of the condensation operations in the way that in translation, typically, you confine the scope of translation to a single sentence or its immediate local context. Condensation summarizing has got to work over the text as a whole. So you've got a very substantial transformation process from the input to the output. If you say, let's guide this by some sort of notion like capture the input concepts, that's far too loose. What do you mean by capture the input concepts? Can we evaluate by some notion of output text coherence? When you're talking about a text as a whole, not an individual sentence or a pair of sentences or question and answer, but a whole text, the notion of coherence is an incredibly loose concept. How on earth are you going to operationalize that kind of thing? I mean, basically the task is not tightly reducible. What should we be capturing? How should we be presenting it? Basically, even if you tried in the summarizing case to evaluate by some sort of analogy with the information extraction case, by giving a set, or even like translation, of giving a set of alternative options, you can't, for the output, you can't really do that because the notion of main concepts in a text is itself a vague notion. And that's reflected in the fact that there are an open number, infinite number of ways of expressing what might be deemed to be the main concepts in an input text. Therefore, you can't sort of give a list of, well, as long as you've got one or other of these options, that will do. That means your condensing engine is all right. Condensing is not extraction, in other words. It's an intrinsically open task. It's even worse than extractions. It's as open as extract all the information. So what you're left with is the notion of evaluating by acceptability. Is this an acceptable summary of this source text? But even so, even if you could make that work, you're not actually free of assumptions about the context. You're not doing context-free core evaluation. You've got some hidden assumptions here, and they're much stiffer than the ones I mentioned briefly in relation to translation. What you're saying is that you're assuming that there is a notion of default summary. It's something sometimes as reflective, as the essence of the source text for a like community. Like on the whole, concepts will be mentioned in the same order and using the same sort of vocabulary and all of those other sort of things as in the source text. So this is a notion of reflective summary. But I say it carries baggage with it because it carries baggage about what sort of audience this summary is going to have. For example, they'll have the same technical knowledge. They'll have the same relative interests. What you're doing is importing a sort of generic functionality without checking its validity. If you try to apply this notion of reflective summary, you're importing a generic functionality into your evaluation without checking whether it's actually valid. or indeed, in fact, applying it directly in the evaluation itself. But much, much more than in the translation case, there is no independent natural summary. And therefore, there can be no core, as it were, default all-purpose core, even to the extent you might have it in machine translation. There's no guarantee, if you think about how summaries, if you look into how summaries are used by people, that it is appropriate, that the best, the preferable form of summary is a reflective one. Summaries are actually used in many different ways, in many different contexts, and they may completely change the focus of the source. They may be very selective rather than simply reductive. They may change the language. They may be evaluative rather than simply. There's a whole lot of things that summaries can be, and one's not saying that a reflective summary is, as it were, better than any other kind of summary, and therefore your core engine ought to be able to do that. So the user, the context and the user for this thing are very much more important than in things like the speech recognition case. As I say, it's because of this radical transformation, you have to say, what are we doing this radical transformation for? And just to show you an example of that, here's a little tiny text. The tests were conducted on 1,000 wombats. They showed half preferred shredded wheat, half Rice Krispies. Now in the UK, shredded wheat and Rice Krispies are cereals, breakfast cereals. Okay, now, we can generate, I defy you to say which of the following 4 summaries is better than any other summary. Wombats have no cereal preferences. Wombats will eat breakfast cereals. Wombats are like people. Huge test on wombats. Now, the last one is tricky, but I mean, domain knowledge for some people, but there'll be scientists, for instance, in fact, my God, they test them on 1,000 wombats. You know, that's incredible. So, automatic summarizing really has barely begun. We've only just begun work in this field. As soon as you think about non-extractive summarizing, I'm not extracting source text sentences, it's very, very hard. And in fact, because it's very complex, you can, well, it is reasonable to work on quite a lot of the core technology needs, which you will need for many contextual cases. I mean, trying to capture discourse structure is an interesting challenge in its own right, and you're jolly well going to need it pretty well whatever sort of summary you're going to want to generate. But particularly also because it's hard to do and therefore we can't do it very well, both in practice as well as in principle, the implication is we should be attending to the context. From this point of view, the DARPA evaluation example is quite good. They evaluated in relation to categorization and retrieval in the relatively restricted evaluations they've done so far. But they are only a modest start, and it is worth noting that the task context, like evaluating summaries for retrieval, is rather undemanding. All you're doing is skimming to get enough of an idea about whether a document is going to be relevant. Now, finally then, even more briefly, and then I want to look at the IT implications in the final section, intelligent inquiry. I've already mentioned this. I mean, by intelligent inquiry, I mean having interactive dialogues about possibly ill-defined needs for information or something like that, or also instruction or all these kind of things. Okay, the speech recognition 80s DARPA I've already mentioned briefly. I just want to look at it now from the point of view of the inquiry evaluation. Like the retrieval case, the users in the core here, you can't do any of this without having users there right in the core operation itself. But the important point, as I've already mentioned, and I want to emphasize again, you can't treat the evaluation of dialogues as it was treated essentially in the 80s evaluation as a question-answer pair type of thing. The interaction is itself, any pair of input-outputs is discourse dependent. It depends on what's gone before, typically. And also the communicative behavior in dialogues between humans and therefore also the system is going to be adaptive. So the notion of evaluation with respect to a question-answer core, the user asked this question, did the system provide the answer to it correctly, like the information extraction case, is just far too restrictive. What you need to do is to support in evaluation some sort of addressing the fact that dialogue is constructive and that it's contextually motivated. So that implies you've got to attend to the context and focus on the user there. And in particular, as I say, you've got to address this session level evaluation. So just to remind you, you've had this one before, and I'll just put it there because I want to mention the last point about it. I mentioned the fact you've really got to evaluate these dialogues as wholes, but it could also be the case that the user started by saying he wanted trains after 6, started by wanting trains after 6 on Sundays, but as a result of the information they get, they change their notion and say, well, if the journey is going to take that long, I want trains before 6 on Sundays. So of course that's a new user goal which has emerged as a result of the information provided. And you've got to allow for that in the evaluation of dialogues. Right, now comparing these tasks, let's pull all this together. What do we learn from this range of different tasks and this attempt to say, this consideration of whether they've got cores and what their cores are like? Some points I've already made because I've compared one task with another, but let's see what now actually emerges from this. Basically, what seems to emerge is that this apparent common DARPA-style evaluation, the fact that they have been treated this way and they appear to fit this DARPA paradigm is actually misleading. There are really large differences between these tasks, and trying to treat them all in the same way, therefore, is just fundamentally misdirected. It's misdirected both because they're not all like one another, and then also because of the fact that the context is important. In particular, there are large differences between them in relation to the nature of the task core. Insofar as there is a core, what does the notion of core technology for these different tasks actually mean? Then we can also ask, because we're in practical working environments, what's the status of such core technology as they legitimately have now, relative to what's desirable? What's the contribution of human users to the deployment of that core system in some larger task context? Let's say, and particularly even for the most basic core evaluation, what's the role of the user there? Well, then it's the balance of the core and the context for some task, like finding information, or using translations for whatever, or extracting information for so-and-so. I mean, in some sense, how much does that core contribute to the whole thing? And just to emphasize how different these things are when you actually inspect them, for example, just some examples. Machine translation has got, as we saw, more autonomous core than information extraction. It's very hard to find any autonomous core in information extraction. The information retrieval current core is on the whole better established and developed than whatever might be a common core that we can currently get in automatic summarizing. The IR core evaluation does require the user in the way that the MT one doesn't. I mean, of course, if you do I'm not saying you can't do core evaluation, you've got to know what you're doing in it. That's my message. On the other hand, you see the automatic summarizing and the MT core competence, they likely contribute much more to the overall task, whatever the overall task is, than retrieval. Summarizing will do a lot for you, more than just finding a few documents if you're interested in a retrieval case. So the conclusion from the review so far is that, let's say the overall message, basically is that once you have some core technology, you should start considering the task context. And certainly once you've got some established technology, you should address the task context. And in this, you shouldn't just be examining the context, in particular as it involves a human user, because it's helpful, especially if we've got rather weak technology, but because information and language processing tasks demand it. Thus, the context and the user, they matter regardless of the, quote, the size of the core. That's because a correct context-free core is not really in practice unattainable, but is in principle unattainable. And so evaluation in the future, I mean, I'm not saying in this that we shouldn't be messing around with core technology at all. Of course, that's nonsense. Of course we want some core capabilities. We clearly want them. And it's right to work on the technology for them and to evaluate them in the current style. But we should be much more clear than we are about what the limitations of that notion of core and evaluation in this core focusing style actually are. That's to say, we should bring in the context much sooner. In particular, we should bring it in at least at a level of a well-specified environment with a statement of its variables and their values for our controlled laboratory experiments. We've got to specify that much more clearly, for example, in the information extraction case, than we do now. Then, of course, we ought to bring in the context much more properly, which in nearly all of these speech and language cases actually involves the live human user. And in particular, where we've got some technology already, we should start doing this now. And in particular, I think we need to do this because, I'm nearly finished now, we really have a pressing need to do this because of the impact of IT evolution, let's say the web and all its works, but also more generally computing technology on the world. These tasks, I've treated them as separate tasks, but they aren't really disjoint tasks at all. And if they're not disjoint tasks, in the way in which I'm going to explain, there really isn't any standalone offline task evaluation that's going to be very, very rewarding to do. I'm not saying it can do nothing for us, but it's going to be much more limited in what it tells us about the functionality of these task engines than we would like to think. Basically, information management, what I call information management, a big area, is seamless. Essentially, if you consider what human users knew now with all the computational tools in the computational environments, in that sense of the word now, that they got, with the tools and resources that they have, really what they're doing is mixing information actions. They're treating what we've talked about hitherto as tasks as subtasks. And they move very freely and very opportunistically from one task to another. For example, just in the information retrieval case, you could argue that formal performance assessment of the kind that we have known for now decades and decades is really becoming irrelevant. Because the minute that the user finds any document that he thinks even faintly promising, he will wander away off to the web page is concerned and start tracking the links from there. And essentially, the users will leave what are now subtasks of their overall operation incomplete. They'll redefine their goals. And in that situation, how can we evaluate, in the style in which we have done, these things which are now subtasks? An example, another example is automatic summarizing. If you do it by sentence extraction and you highlight sentences in displayed texts on the fly in relation to the documents that have been retrieved by a user for some query. So the highlighting may itself be driven by reference, not to the source document in its own right independently, but in relation to the user's query. That is a completely contextually dependent operation of summarizing. And it will have to be evaluated solely as how that highlighting contributes in that unique one-off situation to that user's activities. So what we're saying, and similarly, we see a beginning of that in the TREC cross-language evaluation, where MT could become a subtask of the retrieval task and be judged within that context. So what we ought to have is really in this situation, the dynamic context is crucial to this whole modern style of information activity. And we've got to tackle it in evaluation. But of course, that's not going to be at all easy. It's going to be, it makes the whole specification of what a task is, or what's now a subtask, very much harder. If we think about summarizing or any kind of information extraction, what kind of specification would we put on a core task engine for these things when they're going to be used in such variable ways, in such variable situations? What should we demand of an information extraction engine if what it does is so dependent on unique contexts, or only statistically and rather broadly characterized sets of contexts? It's also the case, of course, that user-oriented evaluation is going to be much harder. If users, you're not really going to want lots of people and lots and lots and lots of cases of information activity. It's going to be very hard to figure out what actually they tell you. There's a challenge, really, of trying to capture this fluid and heterogeneous environments that people will work in, and even for any kind of controlled experiment, and of course even more challenge if you try to evaluate one of these all-encompassing, multi-purpose, multifunctional information management setups as a whole, which embeds a variety of different tasks. And basically the jokers that we've got in all of this is generalizing over applications or even over tasks, defining tasks at the generic level subtask that's going to be, is going to be just very, very difficult. What kind of generalization can we have? And the other thing, which is going to be a very difficult joker in some of the new style of evaluation that, for example, Donna Harmon has been adumbrating, and I'm supporting her in this, and it's going to be a problem, is supposing you have some task systems as subsystems, and you concatenate their inputs and outputs. You know, the output of one is the input to another. And system A, it only has a rather, quotes, medium level of performance, and system B has only got a medium level of performance. What does that imply for the output of B, which is what the user sees when he didn't see and didn't want to see and didn't need to see, in some sense, the output of A? What happens to this incremental performance effects if the user isn't there at every stage, although the user is actually vital? So how do we evaluate subtasks, that is, when they become components and they don't, quotes, unquote, work perfectly? Okay, right. That's it. Can I turn this thing off? Somebody will have to turn it off for me.
Can help you.
Okay.
Might be some question.
I was going to say, I'm around for today and tomorrow, so people can ask me questions anytime. Yeah?
So I'd like to talk, really gets me thinking. So I use a speech recognition every day for writing papers, proposals, and dictation.
Right.
And I guess they put a lot of work into the interface, so
Top right frame.
so back how to
The
back
top.
up, how to make
Wait, hang on, we're all struggling.
Top right, that's it. All right.
Takes real brains, doesn't it, Fred? Same with me. Right, sorry, yes.
So they put a lot of work in this interface, how to back up, how to insert formatting commands, how to extract information from you that they can learn from. And so if they ask me, where do you want us to spend the next 20,000 man-hours on our product, I would say, look, do it all on the interface, don't do anything on the speech recognition accuracy itself. Even though it's really bad, speech recognition accuracy, it's much more important to me as an everyday user to get this interface working better and better and better. But I guess what, and MT companies are the same way. They know how to use the user, and they don't know how to make better translations, so that's what they're doing. I guess I figured that the companies are all doing this kind of in-context evaluation and worrying about the users, and we're supposed to be doing more longer range work on making better accuracy of both translation and speech. So.
Well, indeed. I mean, a lot of the MT evaluation that the Europeans do is very much focused on things. If you're a company and you want to buy an MT system, what should you be asking of it, you see? So, yeah. But I mean, I think to be fair, I mean, I've been a bit prerogative. Of course, there has to be some, quotes, core competence. But I think what's interesting is what levels do you have to have for different purposes? You see, they had this with translation. There came a point where the translation was so bad for such a long time that the human translators said, I don't want to mess with this. But then it got good enough, they said, oh yeah, it's quicker and easier for me to edit that now than to do the whole job myself. Okay. But again, that would depend in your case. You know, what are you using this dictation for? Yeah?
So if the web means that now everybody's going to be doing opportunistic adaptation of their tasks and just combining little subcomponents right and left, maybe there is no one task and there's no hope of coming up with user-oriented tasks, and the only thing we should focus on is component technology, so they have all these little components they can use and pull together as they see fit.
Well, you could argue that's what's happening in the marketplace. People are actually doing that. They just shovel. They don't do much formal evaluation beyond some rather intuitive stuff. And then the Japanese did that for a long time. They made gadgets, and if they sold, it was all right. You could argue that's the one true form. I mean, to be wrong, that's the one true form of objective evaluation. But I mean, I think. I do believe in, I've believed for a long time in laboratory experiments, I do believe in core technology evaluation, but I think we've got to be much more clear. I mean, the thing that worries me particularly is the information extraction task. I mean, it may be that somebody somewhere, but I've never seen it in the obviously published literature about what this stuff is actually for. I mean, in some sense, I know what it's for. It's those analysts. But I don't really know. For example, I have no idea how long-term the stuff's meant to be. How much people look at the databases that are built from these templates and edit them. They say, for example, oh, obviously, this extracted name here is the same as that extracted name there, so I'll merge them in the database. I mean, you know, that's the sort of thing which makes a considerable difference. And if you knew that everything you extracted in information extraction was going to go into a full-blown entity relation, blah, 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 data bottle with semantics thing, or whatever it was, you know, the sort of kosher stuff that you're really supposed to have with databases, I'd be very worried about what I pulled out. I'd sort of hedge everything around with question marks, you know. And then I have special operators in my database retrievals, database query system said, if it's got a query, then do the following, you know.
So I guess I can understand if you're going to say that I want to use the context to decide which of my accuracy measures or whatever are more
Right.
important. This is a recall-oriented task, or I have to reduce my false alarms or something like
Right.
that. I can understand that. That's, I don't think anybody's going to argue with it. But if you start to try to move beyond that and try to get the user more involved as part of the evaluation process, it seems like you end up with the sort of thing that happens in the information retrieval community when people try to do user interactive experiments, and they end up building these elaborate systems, and they're so complicated overall that they can't actually conclude anything. And
Well, I agree. That's partly because one's trying to do laboratory-style evaluation, so you're trying to control all the environment variables.
So how do we do an evaluation with users if it's not a laboratory evaluation? It's easy to say, let's get users involved. It's a lot harder to figure out how.
I agree. I think it then becomes very essentially it's sort of social evaluation I mean you have to address it much more in terms of what I called in the original was setup. What's the setup for, you see? That's really what you're saying. So in this case, supposing we're doing the information extraction, you say, okay, well, we want to make the analysts more effective. You know, it's to help them reach their crucial, whatever the analysts do. I mean, you know, it's to help it's to help them do it more quickly or with fewer mistakes. Like, you know, they shouldn't have caused the planes to be sent there. They should be sent to there. I mean, an example of this is that when they Bletchley parked in the UK during the war, when they were decoding the German encrypted materials, it was absolutely fascinating. There was a young man of about 26. They had all of this apparatus of the code cracking stuff, and then when they cracked the codes, they had lots and lots and lots of ultimately hard work people actually decrypting the individual messages. And then they had somebody to look at the messages and decide, in this enormous flood of information, how many of them should actually get sent by couriers to London? Because you couldn't send them all to London. You know, the government, the high command was far too busy. I mean, they couldn't possibly themselves read tens of thousands of messages, you know, like send 3 trucks here or send 5 soldiers there or stuff like this. Somebody had to form some judgments about which one should go. So in that sense, then you'd say, okay, we'll evaluate the effectiveness of this whole message handling scene by, did it cause the people who were running the war to run it better or more disastrously? Of course, that's a very difficult thing to
Seems
decide.
like expensive evaluation.
It was. Yes, right.
I have 2 comments on this information extraction. Now, first of all, of course, the analysts tell you to fill in these boxes. But that is the task.
Yeah.
And to say that you want more, I don't understand what that means. They want this. Now, of course, they want something entirely different. But that's a different question.
Yeah.
This is as much as they are willing to reveal to you.
Yeah.
So what it is that you are requiring, they are already fulfilling. That's number 1. Number 2, if you can fill these boxes, then some other boxes that they actually want, you will probably be able to fill also. They just won't let you fill it. They'll fill it themselves.
Yeah.
So that seems okay.
Right.
Thirdly, you now have a completely trivial technology to fill those boxes.
Yeah.
Why should we do speech recognition to fit that technology? It cannot be bad to have errorless speech recognition.
No.
That cannot make this technology work.
No, I agree.
And to,
Right.
Okay.
I mean, Fred, I was being deliberately extreme. I was, of course. What I'm saying is, it's not clear what you can learn. I mean, the business about entities and the information extraction, I think, is quite. Of course, you can evaluate. If they say these are what we have deemed to be, for whatever our reasons are, the answers for these things, then we can measure your success with that. But the question we have to say is what have we learned about information extraction other than...
No, you've learned about filling boxes.
Yes. Something about filling some boxes.
Right.
Yeah, right, okay. But it's an interesting question how much you can generalize about the filling of other boxes in other ways, you see, because again, there is the issue about, are you talking about the same people or not? You know, all this stuff about
Yeah, but if you fill these boxes badly, you probably are filling other boxes badly too.
I agree.
So it's not bad to say
No.
that the guy who fills the boxes best is the winner.
Yeah, he's the winner in that rather limited competition.
In others is the probable winner.
Yeah. Well, we don't know.
We don't know, but
Right, okay.
you're not going to pick the loser as the best guy.
No, but I think the point which is rather different is we may attach more importance to the fact that person A has got 5% better performance than person B than is really necessary.
but in actual fact, they never cancel anybody's contract.
Okay. Okay, some of us out there don't have contracts, so it's a different sort of scene. Okay, but no, I agree. Look here, I also agree with you entirely about the speech thing, in fact, namely that, of course, we would like to have the technology, but what I'm saying is that we tend to become so obsessed by it that I mean, the speech case, you could argue, is one of the clearest because it is a well-defined core task and it has got a...
It, in fact, is the clearest.
Yeah. What I'm complaining about is making the others like it, because that's what I think is more problematic. Yeah.
A lot of our research is directed using corpora
Yeah.
that are canned and frozen. Yet the information access that we want most often is on the internet, which is a dynamic variable.
Yeah.
So let's presume that we pose an information access query that can be answered from a number of sources.
Yeah.
Now then, what's the correct answer? Is it ultimately a measure of user satisfaction? Is there no truth? Or are we, did we fabricate some kind
Well, you see, I think...
pseudo-web?
Well, the question I think partly is do we know enough about... When we're talking about relevant, part of the problem with the relevant documents thing is that, of course, that's a very weak characterization of why it's relevant to the user, what it makes it, what he wants to use it for, if you see what I mean. It's correctness, relevance and correctness are rather loose, relevance is a loose approximation to correctness. And in fact, in that case, that isn't correct, do you see what I mean? And part of the business I was trying to show with my example, IR example, was that you could have a different, it's a dynamic situation, you could have a different view of how things were evolving, just depending on the prior output you actually got. So, and you see, it's certainly the case that we don't, for example, I'm not quite sure whether I'm answering your question exactly, but we don't, for instance, pay attention to the extent to which documents overlap. Now, I know TDT and these kind of things would be interested in this, but in our normal evaluations, we pay no attention to whether the user's seen the even seen the document before, and secondly, whether there are two documents saying essentially the same thing, so it doesn't need one of them, you see. So, now, when you're saying correct, I think what I'd really say, in some sense, it's like summarizing. Summarizing, you can really only evaluate it for what it's... If you have a summarizing system, the only... You can do a lot of informal or constrained evaluation, as in the IE case. You can say, did your engine succeed in capturing this concept, which I'm going to deem myself to be a main concept in this paper, and you can express it in the following 14 ways. Okay, did you succeed in doing that? We'll learn something from doing that. I'm not saying we won't. But basically, summaries are really of value, more or less value, different values to people in their particular situation of using a summary. Thus, on one occasion, I use a summary to remind me what a paper I've read before is about. Another occasion, I'm using a summary to say, do I want to read this paper? Another occasion, I'll be using a summary to send to somebody, saying, this is the sort of thing I'm interested in. See what I mean? There's many different roles.
But the point I wanted you to address is
Yeah.
that the web is dynamically varying.
Yeah, that's right.
And so a correct answer at one moment may not
No, indeed it won't be. No, indeed it won't be.
be
So,
the most correct answer at another moment.
that's right. No, indeed it won't. So all you're saying is that if we do lots of slices, and we reckon that at that time our system will deliver what at that time would be good.
So we're left with frozen web facsimiles.
We're doing controlled experiments, just as we've always done with these test collections. We're doing frozen web experiments. In fact, I find this very difficult, because when I lecture to my undergraduates on the retrieval course, I do a web search for topics, because I want to show them what searching is like on the web. And each year when I do it, of course, I get completely different stuff. But okay, but you can still do a comparative experiment, but you have, well, as you say, you have to bear in mind that that's time-bound truth. Yeah.